Let me start by saying that I am not a person who asks for thanks. Honestly, I'm not. When you spend 2 decades of your life pouring every ounce of energy, every last dime, and every single moment of personal freedom into raising a child that isn't even technically yours, you do it because you love them. You do it because you have to. My name is Olivia, and the girl I raised was Chloe, my only granddaughter. And at her wedding, on the biggest, most expensive, most ridiculous day of her life, she didn't just forget me, she actively chose to erase me. The air in that ballroom was thick with expensive perfume lilies, and a kind of suffocating, manufactured happiness. The wedding was magnificent, the kind you see in movies, costing more than I made in 5 years. And let me tell you, I knew exactly how magnificent it was, down to the $40,000 venue fee. I sat there at a side table, feeling like a misplaced piece of old furniture. I was dressed nicely, of course, in a tailored suit I bought specifically for the occasion, but I knew I didn't fit with the glittering young crowd surrounding Chloe and her new husband, Brandon. Brandon's parents, the Hollands, were dripping in quiet wealth, the kind that doesn't need to show off but still manages to make you feel poor just by standing near them. They sat at the head table, beaming. I was nowhere near the head table. I was near the DJ's speakers, which, trust me, was a hint of what was coming. The toast started. Brandon's best man stood up, shared a few embarrassing but charming stories, and toasted the couple. Brandon's father, Mr. Holland, gave a moving speech about welcoming Chloe into their esteemed family, which made me roll my eyes so hard I almost gave myself a headache. Then it was Chloe's turn. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I thought would make all the years of sacrifice, the endless night shifts, the student loans I took out for her worth it. Not for the public recognition, mind you, but just for the shared moment, the acknowledgement that we did this together. She looked stunning. Absolutely breathtaking. Her dress was ivory satin, custom-made, another detail I knew the price of. She took the mic, and her voice, usually a little shaky, was strong and clear. She thanked Brandon for being her rock. She thanked the Hollands for being the family she always dreamed of. That was the first paper cut. Then she started her list of thank yous, and this is where the real horror show began. I need to thank the people who truly made me who I am today, she began, sweeping the room with a gaze that somehow managed to skip right over my corner. First, to my high school debate coach, Mr. Peterson. Thank you for teaching me how to stand up for myself. I remember Mr. Peterson. He gave her a C once for missing a deadline. She moved on. To Sarah, my maid of honor. Thank you for being the sister I never had and always making me laugh even when things were tough. Sarah was a wonderful girl, no doubt. But Sarah was around for 4 years. I was around for 20. Then came the kicker. She looked toward the back, smiling genuinely. And I want to give a huge shout out to Mrs. Davies, my neighbor from when I was a kid. You always had cookies ready, and you taught me the importance of community. Mrs. Davies. Bless her heart, she was sweet. She taught Chloe how to bake rudimentary chocolate chip cookies. I taught Chloe how to read, how to drive a stick shift, how to apply for college without losing her mind, and how to survive the loss of her parents when she was just 2. The list went on. Her mentor at work. Her college roommate. The caterer for the delicious appetizers. Seriously, the caterer. She thanked everyone in that room who had contributed a single grain of sand to her life speech, except for the person who built the entire coast she was standing on. I sat there frozen. The champagne in my glass felt like acid. I wasn't just left out of the toast. I was deliberately omitted from the narrative of her life. It was a surgical strike, clean and brutal. It wasn't an accident. In the context of her perfectly prepared 5-minute speech, every omission was a choice. My heart didn't break. It turned into a solid, heavy rock in my chest, sinking down to my stomach. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this icy distance from her. But doing it in front of 200 people who were now whispering and glancing my way, made it the cruelest. I saw a flicker of recognition in the corner of her eye as she finished. She knew I was there. She saw my table. She just decided that $40,000 for the venue, $15,000 for her custom dress, $10,000 for the open bar, and 2 decades of my existence weren't worth a single syllable. It was in that quiet, burning moment that I made my decision. The rock in my chest solidified into determination. I had a secret, a quiet, meticulously kept secret that had been sitting in my safe deposit box for 3 years. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense, but about confronting a fundamental, deeply toxic lie that she was living. A lie that had hurt me more than I could articulate. I had raised her to be honest, and yet here she was, the centerpiece of a magnificent deception. I looked around the room. Everyone was smiling, clapping. They saw a beautiful bride, a loving couple, and a successful young woman with a bright future. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the stack of unopened final notices I paid so she could have that semester abroad. They didn't see the years I drove an antique rust bucket while she drove a reliable sedan I bought her when she turned 16. They saw the champagne flutes, not the ramen noodles I ate so she could have the best of everything. And as I sat there, stewing in this public humiliation, I want to know something from you. When you are watching this, where are you and what time is it? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time of day it is. Let me know I'm not alone in a moment like this. The reception started quickly after the toasts. The music went up and people started moving to the dance floor. I stayed seated. A few distant relatives, my sister, my cousin, came over and offered me a few awkward pats on the shoulder and mumbled sympathies. "She must have just been nervous, Olivia," they said. The spotlight got to her. I just nodded, a tight, fixed smile on my face. I knew better. This wasn't nervousness. This was calculated. I watched Chloe and Brandon have their first dance. It was perfect, like something out of a magazine. As I watched them sway, I felt a deep sense of separation, not just emotional but physical. I was looking at a stranger, a woman I had literally sacrificed everything for, who now pretended I was a ghost. I spent the next hour just watching the room, observing the joy and the laughter, none of it directed at me or including me. I drank my water, ignored the tiny, expensive portions of dinner and waited. I had something to deliver and I needed the moment to be right. Not a spectacle. I'm too much of a private person for a public meltdown, but a moment that was undeniably, irretrievably hers. I just needed the noise and the crowd to thin out a bit. I needed her to be slightly more alone than she was right now. The envelope was in my clutch bag, heavy, sealed, and containing a truth that was about to turn her flawless world upside down. To understand the weight of that envelope, you have to understand the 20 years that led up to it. My story with Chloe didn't start with a happy nursery and a planned family. It started with a tragedy. Chloe was 2 years old when her parents, my daughter Sarah and her husband Michael, died in a car accident. One minute they were there and the next they were gone. Just like that. I was 45, finally feeling like I had a handle on my own life, ready to travel, maybe even retire early. Then suddenly I was a primary caregiver for a toddler with ringlets and tear-soaked eyes. I didn't hesitate. There was no question of who would take her. I went straight to the court. Michael's parents, Chloe's other grandparents, were wealthy, but they lived overseas and were, frankly, emotionally detached. They offered to pay for a live-in nanny and private schooling if Chloe stayed with them, but they weren't offering a home, they were offering a lifestyle. I looked at that little girl, terrified and clinging to my skirt, and I knew she needed stability and love, not just expensive clothes. I fought for custody and I won. And from that day on, I became Nana Olivia, her mother, father, and primary source of everything. My savings account, which was looking healthy before the accident, became the Chloe Fund. I went back to work full-time, taking on extra shifts as a medical coder, often working late into the night. My dream of early retirement? Gone. My little house, which I loved, suddenly felt small and crowded, filled with tiny shoes and plastic toys. But honestly, I didn't care. Seeing her smile, hearing her little giggle when I chased her around the kitchen, was more payment than any paycheck. The sacrifices were small at first, then they snowballed. Remember I mentioned the ramen? That was a running joke, except it wasn't really a joke. When Chloe was in middle school, she desperately wanted to go on a school trip to Washington, D.C. The cost was exorbitant for a single grandmother making a modest salary. I told her we'd figure it out. That whole year, my dinner was often a bowl of cheap noodles, spiced up with whatever leftovers I could find, while Chloe ate nutritious, balanced meals. I wore the same coat for 8 years. I skipped every single dentist and doctor visit for myself because every spare $100 went into her college savings account or her school supplies. Sounds like martyrdom, but it was just life. It was just what you do for someone you love more than yourself. The real shift, the beginning of the distance, happened around the time she hit high school. She was smart, popular, and incredibly focused on success. She looked at her friends' families, families with 2 parents, families with newer cars, and started to get a complex. I overheard her talking to a friend once, whispering about how she wished her family was normal. It crushed me, but I rationalized it as typical teenage angst. I pushed her to excel, to focus on her education, thinking that professional success would validate my years of effort. When it came time for college, she applied to the top, most expensive schools. I never once told her to aim lower. I secretly liquidated the last of my long-term investments, the ones I was saving for my eventual retirement, to cover the application fees and travel expenses for campus visits. When she got into her dream university, a private school with jaw-dropping tuition, I celebrated with her. I hugged her and told her I was so proud. But inside, I knew what that acceptance letter meant for my future. It meant I would never stop working. And here is where the toxic secret started to fester. Chloe was always sensitive about being different. I think she felt ashamed that she didn't have two parents, and later, that I wasn't as wealthy as her friends' parents. She started minimizing me. She would introduce me to new friends as my grandmother Olivia. But somehow the tone made it sound like I was just the slightly confused older relative who housed her, not the woman who stayed up until 2 a.m. helping her write term papers. Her university, being a private institution, required extensive financial aid forms. I had to provide detailed tax returns and bank statements. The tuition was $60,000 a year. She qualified for some small grants, but the bulk of it, $40,000 annually, was on us. I took out a Parent Plus loan in my name, effectively mortgaging my future income. I also dipped into the trust fund that Michael's parents had set up for her, but that money was explicitly designated for her after graduation, not for tuition. She knew that trust existed, and I think in her mind that was the money funding her life. She assumed that was the source of all the cash, the rich grandparents she barely saw, not the woman living on a budget in her small house. I never corrected her. Why? Because I was exhausted. I was tired of fighting her subtle shame. I wanted her to feel proud and confident, like she belonged among her well-off peers. If letting her believe the money came from a distant, wealthy source made her feel better, I bit my tongue. I signed the loan papers, I paid the monthly bills, and I just kept working. The financial aid paperwork, the loan agreements, the proof that $160,000 over 4 years was personally guaranteed by Olivia, not an anonymous trust, not a distant relative, was all sealed away. She had seen the trust account balance, which was substantial, but she never saw the fine print stating it couldn't be touched until she had her diploma in hand. She assumed I was using it, and I let her. This was the core of the painful dynamic that was playing out at the wedding. She thought I was just the nice, older lady who provided a place to sleep and access to a massive, impersonal trust fund. She didn't see me as the person who sacrificed her entire future for her present. She never saw the sacrifice because I deliberately hid the struggle so she wouldn't feel guilty. She never saw the loan documents, the monthly struggle to meet the payments, or the interest piling up on the Parent Plus loan. Now she was a successful, beautiful graduate marrying Brandon, who came from an actually wealthy family. She had achieved the normalcy she craved. And to cement that new, successful identity, she had to quietly remove the messy, sacrificing grandmother from the picture. If she acknowledged my struggle and sacrifice, it would acknowledge the years of ramen, the old car, and the small house. It would acknowledge the cost of her success, which she seemed determined to ignore. The only acknowledgement she was prepared to give was icy silence and omission. And I was done letting her erase my truth to fuel her glamorous lie. I had the paperwork to prove it, and it was getting heavy in my clutch. The wedding planning phase was where the underlying conflict, the one fueled by Chloe's deep-seated need to appear wealthy and normal, really flared up. When Brandon proposed, he did it with a diamond the size of a pigeon egg, which frankly made me nervous. Brandon's family, the Hollands, were undeniably good people, but they were also high society. They saw weddings as social events to be executed flawlessly and expensively. Chloe, eager to impress and desperate to finally belong, bought into their vision hook, line, and sinker. The first meeting with the Hollands was where things got complicated. They were lovely, but their language was foreign to me. They talked about $100,000 budgets as if it were pocket change. They kept saying, "Don't worry, Chloe, we want you to have the wedding of your dreams. We'll contribute significantly." I, the silent partner, the woman who had already paid for her daughter's entire education, simply nodded along. Chloe, beaming, reinforced the assumption. Nana has been so generous, but Brandon's parents are stepping up to handle the big details. She conveniently didn't specify what generous meant, but the implication was clear. I was contributing a modest sum, maybe $10,000, while the Hollands were the true saviors of the budget. In reality, the Hollands' significant contribution was $30,000, earmarked specifically for the honeymoon and a contribution towards the venue. The total wedding cost by the time the final invoice came in was close to $150,000. Chloe insisted on a destination photographer, custom letterpress invitations, and an open bar featuring premium liquor, none of which the Hollands were willing to fund beyond their initial pledge. "Nana," Chloe said one afternoon, looking stressed as she held up a bill for specialty imported linens. "This is $8,000. It's ridiculous, but Brandon's mother insisted they are the only ones that photograph well. The Hollands won't cover it, and I don't have that kind of money. Can you front it? We'll work it out later." Work it out later, in Chloe's dictionary, meant you pay it. But I couldn't say no. I was trapped by my own years of sacrifice. I had invested so much in her future, in her happiness, that I felt compelled to finish the job. If I pulled the plug now, citing financial strain, it would expose the carefully crafted facade she had built for Brandon and his family. It would confirm her biggest fear, that she wasn't actually wealthy, and that the only reason she was succeeding was because of the quiet, constant struggle of her working-class grandmother. So I sold the one thing I had left, a small plot of rural land that my own father had given me decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it represented my last financial safety net. I liquidated it quickly, quietly, and poured the funds into her wedding account. That land sale covered the linens, the flowers, the catering overruns, and yes, that absurd $15,000 custom wedding dress she wore. All the receipts, all the wire transfers, all the evidence of this final devastating sacrifice were collected meticulously in a single file by my accountant. I started keeping the account balance separate from my personal finances, treating it like a business transaction. It was a coping mechanism. The money was gone, but now I had tangible proof of where every single penny went. The money I was spending was the last of my liquidity, the last of my ability to financially recover. I was truly starting over at 65 with a massive college loan debt hanging over my head and zero savings. The conflict deepened because she started treating me less like a loving relative and more like an ATM that needed to be kept lubricated with occasional compliments. If she needed a huge sum, she'd suddenly call me the world's best nana. Once the check cleared, the distance would snap back into place. The most painful layer was the moral dilemma. Was I enabling her vanity? Absolutely. But I was also trying to preserve what little emotional connection we had left, knowing that confronting her about the financial reality would shatter her trust and force her to face a truth she wasn't ready for. I desperately wanted her to realize the cost on her own, to come to me humble and grateful and say, "Nana, I know this is too much. Let's scale back." That conversation never happened. Instead, the week before the wedding, I went to her apartment to drop off the last payment for the florist. She was having a pre-wedding gathering with her bridesmaids. I knocked and Chloe answered, looking annoyed. "Nana, I'm kind of busy," she said, not even inviting me inside. "I just have the florist's check," I said, holding out a sealed envelope. She grabbed it without meeting my eyes. "Great, thanks. Listen, I have to run. Sarah is helping me finalize the seating chart, and we need to make sure the Hollands relatives are at the best table. You're fine where you are, right? Table 12. Table 12. Next to the speakers. Away from the head table. Away from the Hollands. Away from her." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Yes, Chloe. Table 12 is fine." "Perfect. See you Saturday." She gave me a quick, distracted air kiss and shut the door. That was the last real conversation we had before the wedding. That quick, dismissive shove to the periphery of her life, relegating me to the nice but unimportant category, right before she walked down the aisle, confirmed everything. Table 12 wasn't just a physical distance. It was a clear statement of my emotional value in her new, perfected life. I went home and called my accountant. I instructed him to compile a comprehensive, irrefutable record of every significant payment I had made for her since she turned 18. The 4 years of Parent Plus loan payments, the $160,000 tuition total, the sale of my land, and the total cost of the wedding items I paid for, down to that $8,000 linen bill. I wanted it all in one sealed document, notarized and dated. Not a messy list, but a professional, legal, and coldly factual summary. That document was the only thing I felt I had left of my 20 years of sacrifice. That document, sealed and sitting in my bag as I watched her thank her neighbor's cookie-making skills, was about to become the turning point. The music was loud, the kind that vibrates in your chest, but the silence inside my head was deafening. I was still at table 12, nursing my glass of sparkling water, watching Chloe on the dance floor. She was doing the cha-cha with Brandon, laughing, completely oblivious, or perhaps completely indifferent, to the icy coldness she had inflicted with her speech. It was the omission, the deliberate choreographed exclusion, that cut the deepest. It wasn't just the lack of a "thank you, Nana." It was the substitute gratitude. Thanking Mrs. Davies for cookies, thanking the caterer for appetizers. These were calculated distractions, filler words meant to occupy the space where my name should have been, validating the lie that she had achieved this life largely on her own merit, with a little help from distant wealthy benefactors. She was telling the world, and more importantly, the Hollands, that she was a self-made woman who didn't rely on a struggling, sacrificial grandmother. About 2 hours into the reception, I saw my opportunity. The formalities were done. The older guests, including many of the Hollands' relatives, had started to trickle out. Chloe was doing the rounds, having intimate, smiling conversations with her closest friends, moving further and further away from the dense center of the party. The band took a short break, and the DJ put on some soft, slow background music. I stood up, adjusting my skirt. The clutch bag felt incredibly heavy, like carrying a brick of compressed emotion. I walked slowly across the ballroom, past the glistening dessert table and the elaborate ice sculpture. My steps were deliberate, measured. I didn't want to cause a scene. I wanted this to be surgical, quiet, and completely unavoidable for her. I found her near the large windows overlooking the city skyline, talking animatedly with Sarah, her maid of honor, and her college roommate, Ella. They were all giggling about something. I cleared my throat softly. "Chloe, may I have a word?" She turned, her radiant smile fading slightly, replaced by a strained look of obligation. Sarah and Ella immediately backed away, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Even they, two young women who hadn't known me long, picked up on the sudden chill. "Nana," Chloe said, her voice polite but clipped like a customer service representative. "What is it? Everything okay? Did you get enough champagne?" The triviality of her concern was the final pinprick. "Everything is fine," I replied, my voice low and steady. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't want the remnants of the crowd to hear this, but I wanted her to feel the absolute gravity of the moment. "I just wanted to offer my congratulations, and I have something for you." I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope. It was sealed with heavy red wax, bearing the stamp of the notary public. It wasn't wrapped in ribbon. It was clearly a serious document. Chloe's eyes went straight to the envelope, and I watched the color drain from her face. That's when I knew she hadn't forgotten the existence of the financial documents. He just hoped I would never use them. She had feared this moment, this piece of paper, more than anything. "What is this, Nana?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the previous confidence completely gone. "This," I said, holding it out, "is your wedding gift. I've given you everything else, dear. This is the last thing you needed from me." She hesitated, not reaching for it. "I don't understand." "A gift. It's a receipt, Chloe. A comprehensive ledger," I explained, maintaining intense eye contact. "It details every major financial contribution I have made to your life since you turned 18. The university tuition, the Parent Plus loans I took out in my name, the land I sold to pay for your gown, your caterer, and those ridiculous linens." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. "It's a complete accounting of the true cost of the life you were celebrating tonight." Her eyes flicked around the room nervously, checking if anyone was listening. This was her greatest fear, the exposure of the truth she had worked so hard to cover up. "Nana, please," she murmured, trying to pull me aside. "Not here. This is my wedding." "Exactly," I agreed softly. "It is your wedding, the magnificent result of 2 decades of my complete sacrifice. A sacrifice you spent 5 minutes publicly denying. You thanked your high school debate coach, Chloe. You thanked the woman who baked cookies 20 years ago. You thanked the Hollands for their significant contribution. But you eliminated the truth of your own life to build a shinier version for your new family." I pressed the heavy envelope into her hands. It was the transfer of the burden. "I don't want your thanks, Chloe," I stated, the words final and absolute. I haven't for a long time. But you need to carry the truth. You need to know what you stand on, and you need to look at this and see the consequences of your choices, not just tonight but for the past few years. Her hands trembled as she took the document. The weight of the envelope seemed to sag her shoulders. She looked at the red wax seal, unable to look me in the eye. Read it, I instructed, my voice unwavering. And when you realize that every single moment of grandeur tonight, every sip of premium champagne, every custom flower arrangement, every stitch of that gown, was paid for by the final, complete liquidation of my entire future, perhaps then you will understand what you just did. I gave her one last long look. It was a look not of anger, but of profound disappointment and emotional exhaustion. I had given up everything and she had repaid it by making me invisible. The turning point was complete. I had delivered the evidence of my sacrifice and her deceit, and now the resolution, whatever it was entirely in her hands. I turned and walked away, not waiting for a response. I walked out of the ballroom, past the tables of happy guests, past the DJ who was queuing up the next song. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just left the sound of the party, and the heavy weight of that sealed envelope in Chloe's shaking hands behind me. I didn't stop walking until I was outside on the sidewalk, hailed a cab and was heading toward my small, quiet house. The ride was silent, a stark contrast to the thumping bass I had just left behind. I didn't look back at the venue. I didn't cry. I was empty, and that emptiness felt cleaner than the emotional chaos I had been living in for the past few years. The debt was settled. Not the financial debt, which still existed in the form of my Parent Plus loans, but the emotional debt. I had presented the truth and now it was out of my hands. The silence didn't last long. I had only been home for maybe an hour, still in my suit sipping a cup of herbal tea, when the phone started ringing, vibrating loudly on the kitchen counter. It was Brandon. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later it was Chloe. I let that go too. A flurry of texts came next, all caps, frantic. Nana, call me. What is this? We need to talk now. I ignored them. I knew what was in that envelope. It wasn't just a list of numbers. It was a narrative of every missed vacation, every cheap meal, every deferred dream, all culminating in the price tag of her perfect day. It was the definitive proof that the trust fund she believed was powering her life hadn't been touched, and that I was the one who had sacrificed my entire economic future. The total amount, including the college tuition and the final wedding bills, was staggering, well over $300,000, all tied back to my name and my liquidated assets. About an hour after the initial barrage, the front door bell rang furiously, followed by pounding on the door. I knew who it was. I opened the door to find Chloe, still in her exquisite $15,000 wedding dress, the custom satin dragging slightly on my porch. She wasn't glowing anymore. Her makeup was smudged and she looked utterly shattered. Brandon was standing slightly behind her, looking confused and stressed, holding the open manila envelope like it was a hot coal. Nana, what have you done? Chloe burst out, her voice shaky. I gave you your wedding gift, dear, I repeated calmly, stepping back and inviting them inside, though the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. Brandon stepped forward, looking at the documents. Olivia, we thought the trust was covering this. Chloe told us that the tuition was handled by the family account. This document, it states you took out the federal loans in your name. For all 4 years. That's correct, Brandon, I said, leaning against the counter. I signed those papers. I paid those bills monthly. The trust fund was untouchable until her degree was conferred. I told her that, but I allowed her to believe the illusion that the money was endless and came from someone else because she was embarrassed of my reality. Chloe's voice cracked. You let me believe it. You let me take out those loans for the last semester. You never said anything about the land. The linens, Nana? $8,000 for linens? You sold your land for linens and a dress. The twist wasn't just the money. It was the realization of the extent of my silence and her complicity in the deceit. She had convinced herself I was a minor contributor, a nice grandmother, who occasionally helped out, not the sole engine of her success. I sold the land, Chloe, because you needed the money for the details that the Hollands deemed beneath them, I explained, my tone flat. And I let you believe the illusion because the truth that you had a grandmother who was willing to eat ramen and wear the same coat for 8 years just so you could have the best of everything, was too embarrassing for you to acknowledge. I looked directly at her, past the wedding dress and the tears. Tonight you publicly erased me. You validated your new, perfected life by eliminating the poor, struggling past I represented. You thanked the caterer, Chloe. That was the resolution of 20 years of sacrifice. Invisibility. The sound in the room was the sound of a glittering facade crashing down. Brandon, bless his heart, looked sick. He hadn't been malicious, just oblivious like most of Chloe's wealthy circle. He finally spoke quietly. Chloe, you told my parents that your grandmother was contributing a respectable amount, but that the family trust was covering the major expenses. Chloe just shook her head, tears streaming. She couldn't speak. She was facing the consequence of her lie, not just to me, but now to her brand new husband and his powerful family. The lie that she was just as financially secure and independent as they were. The envelope, I concluded, gesturing to the papers in Brandon's hand, doesn't ask for the money back. It asks for the truth. It's for you to carry the weight of what you asked me to give up, and what you chose to ignore. I never saw the Hollands again, but I heard the repercussions. The wedding night was understandably ruined. The next few weeks were a confusing mix of tearful apologies from Chloe and incredibly stiff formal communications from Brandon's parents, expressing shock and offering to help mediate the financial disparity. I refused their help. My debt was mine and the lesson was Chloe's. The final resolution was this. Chloe and Brandon eventually paid off the entire outstanding balance of the Parent Plus loans. Not because I demanded it, but because Brandon insisted on clearing the debt that was now legally tied to his wife's name. Chloe started calling me regularly, not asking for money but just to talk. It was a slow, painful crawl back to any kind of relationship, but the toxic lie was finally cleared. The greatest closure, however, was for me. I realized that my years of silent financial sacrifice had taught Chloe that my value was purely transactional. By handing her that envelope, I forced her to see the human cost of her ambition. And in doing so, I finally drew a line in the sand for myself. I got my life back even if it was delayed and debt-ridden. And she finally learned that some debts, the ones measured in love and sacrifice, are far heavier than those measured in dollars. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed hearing how this terrible situation finally came to a head, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of difficult family dynamics and unexpected twists.